You're a working class girl in the 1910s, and you have the job of your dreams. You quickly get jobs for all the young women in your family, and life is the sweetest it's ever been. Then you realize that the job you thought had saved you and your family was slowly killing them, one by one. What would you do? I'm Heidi, and this is Obsession, where we get horribly obsessed with historical stories and we illustrate them. Today, we are talking about the tragic and heroic Radium Girls. It was a fine April day in 1917, Orange, New Jersey, and 18-year-old Molly Magia arrived for her first day of work at the Radium Luminous Materials Corps. Molly was one of 7 sisters and the daughter of Italian immigrants. Her sisters Quinta and Albina had been working for the company, and they had been able to secure her the most enviable job a young working class girl of that time could have: a dial painter. Molly would use her artistic skills to paint the numbers and hands on clocks and watches. Instead of backbreaking work on a noisy factory floor, Molly would be able to sit in an orderly studio and chat with desk mates as she worked. Even better, she would be paid 3 times the amount that she would in a factory, and she would be referred to as an artist. Also, she would be working with the most expensive and most exciting material anyone could work with: radium. During her training, Molly was shown how to mix the radium powder with water and glue that would make paint that would glow in the dark. Then she was shown how to keep a fine point on her paintbrush by dipping her pen into the paint, putting it between her lips, and then painting. This was called dip, lip, and paint, and all the girls had to do it. The same could have been achieved with putting the brush in water, but too much of the very expensive radium paint was being wasted that way. Lip dip and paint was economical. Now, during these training sessions, there would often be someone who asked, "Is it safe to put the paint in our mouths?" And their supervisor would reassure them that not only was radium perfectly harmless, but it was so healthy that it would put roses in their cheeks. Hadn't they heard of radiation being used to treat cancer? So how could something that was used to treat cancer make you sick? Well, at this moment, you're probably rightly horrified, but radium really was being marketed to the public as a health product. Marie and Pierre Curie had only discovered it around 20 years prior, and while they and other scientists knew the possible dangers, the general public didn't. In the 1910s and 20s, radium was referred to as liquid sunshine, and it was put in tonics, toothpaste, cosmetics. One German confectionery company even had it in their chocolate. Now remember, people couldn't just hop online and do their own research. They generally trusted what they read in magazines and advertisements, or much more than we would now. Molly and her workmates felt lucky to be working with this almost magical element, and they had some fun with it. When mixing the paint, which was branded as Undark, great name, the powder would puff up, fall in their hair and on their faces and clothes. Then, when they were walking home, they would actually glow in the dark, much to the awe and astonishment of people passing by. The dial painters were affectionately known as the Ghost Girls, a nickname that would take on a more sinister relevance in the years to come. The Ghost Girls would paint their nails and teeth with undark paint, and sometimes they would wear their best dresses to work so that when they went to the evening dances, they could shimmer like fairies as they spun around the dance floor. April 1917 was when the US officially joined World War I, and the radio dial business boomed. Not only were they producing clocks and watches for the public, but watches for the soldiers that could be read in the darkness of the trenches, as well as military dials to be used in warplanes. The Radium dial companies in New Jersey, Illinois, and New York all needed as many girls and women as possible in these jobs, and the dial painters were securing jobs for their sisters, female cousins, their friends. Now, the reason why they hired women for dial painting was because they needed small, delicate hands to do this kind of work. And some of the girls had very small hands indeed, seeing that the youngest painters were only around 11 years old. So, the money was amazing. The girls formed tight friendships and had fun together, and they knew that their work was contributing to the war effort, which made them immensely proud. So, that's perfect, right? Well, it was, until 1921, when Molly Magia got an annoying toothache. She had the tooth pulled, but then another started hurting, and then another. She felt exhausted and joked about suddenly turning into an old woman. Each tooth that was removed was replaced with a bleeding, pus-filled abscess, and Molly could hardly eat or drink without crying in pain. Also, she was ashamed of her breath, which had started to smell rotten. She had to quit her beloved job when the pain spread from her mouth to her limbs. The doctor gave her aspirin. Nobody knew what to do. Then, during the most nightmare-inducing dentist visit of all time, Molly's dentist tried to gently remove an abscessed tooth, and part of her jaw came away in his hand. The rest of her lower jaw was surgically removed a couple of days later. Something was savagely devouring Molly from the inside out. Within months, the infection brutally made its way through Molly's throat and finally through her jugular vein. At the age of 24, Molly was drowned by her own blood as it flooded her mouth. Her death certificate stated her cause of death as syphilis. Spoiler alert, it wasn't syphilis. Molly wasn't the only dial painter to have been troubled by these symptoms. One by one, the women started complaining of jaw pain, aching limbs, unexplained weight loss, and fatigue. One woman walked past a mirror in the dark and was horrified to see her bones glowing through her skin. When they spoke to management, they were accused of fear-mongering and being hysterical. But the problem didn't just go away. Some of the dial painters started to question the lip dip paint method, and they were told not to spread malicious gossip about the company. Other girls were dying in the same cruel, agonizing way that Molly had, and the management wasn't doing anything. Well, they refused to listen to their staff, but they had to listen to public speculation, at least for the sake of their profit margins. Concerned about optics, the USRC had an independent study carried out about the safety of working with radium, and to their inconvenience, a strong link was found between the recent deaths of some of the dial painters and working with undark radium paint. No matter, the head of the firm simply covered up the results of the study, commissioned a new study, one that would find more favourable results. Anyway, weren't those girls dying of syphilis? Oh dear, spreading their venereal diseases around town, bad girls come to a bad end. And now they're blaming it on the company, expecting us to pay their doctor's bills. Or so the company wanted the public to believe. We can only imagine the terror the remaining dial painters were feeling. Even women who had quit working there years ago were dying. Every day was a torturous wait for the aches and pains that would signal the beginning of disfigurement and death. Then, in 1925, a male employee of the firm died, and everyone suddenly sat up and took notice. I'll just add here that the men who worked for the company wore protective gear, like lead aprons, when they were around radium. So, a doctor called Harrison Martland did his own research and testing and discovered some chilling information about what radium could do to the body when ingested. So, radiation eats holes inside the body, and the bones of the dial painters ended up looking like honeycomb. This is why they were literally crumbling to pieces while they were still alive. So radium has a very similar chemical makeup to calcium. So when radium is ingested, the body mistakes it for calcium and distributes it to the bones. That was also the reason for so many sarcomas or bone cancers found on the dial painters. Of course, the USRC did not like this and started a campaign to discredit Martland's findings. The firm was trying their hardest to break everyone's spirits, but the one thing they couldn't break was the bonds of friendship between dial painters past and present. These women nursed each other, supported each other, and stood staunchly together against immense corporate evil. One of the leaders to emerge was Grace Fryer. Like Molly Maggia, Grace had started at US Radium in 1917, aged 18. Grace's father was a union representative, and he'd brought his children up to be very political. Grace was smart, opinionated, and confident. She was a dial painter for around 3 years before taking a bank job and getting married. About 2 years after leaving US Radium, Grace began to suffer from fatigue. Her jaw began to ache and her teeth began to fall out. In 1925, she finally found a doctor willing to consider that she may have radiation poisoning. Troubled by the investigations of Grace Fryer, US Radium got one of their industrial toxicologists to pretend to be a medical specialist who wanted to examine Grace. He told her that she was in fine health, something that Grace absolutely knew wasn't true. She was wearing a metal brace because her spine was collapsing, and she was constantly picking bits of her jaw out of her gums. This wasn't the only slimy and deceitful things the radium companies were doing around this time. Some radium companies were taking control of autopsies and burials, making sure that everything was carried out by people on their payroll. Grace had had enough. Along with former dial painters Catherine Schaub, Edna Hussman, Quinta Magia MacDonald, and Albina Larice, Grace planned legal action against US Radium. Quinta and Albina were the sisters of Molly, the first known girl to die. Albina had been suffering from fertility issues and had given birth to a stillborn baby. Indeed, many former dial painters were having trouble conceiving, or they were having babies that had been poisoned in utero. It took 2 years before they found a lawyer willing to take their case, and by this time their health had deteriorated further. Raymond Berry was the brave lawyer who had taken on the task, and the odds were not in his favor. The statute of limitations was 5 months after injury, and radiation poisoning wasn't even on the list of injuries that could be compensated since it was such a new concept. The trial hit the newspapers, and the 5 women were dubbed the Radium Girls. Even Marie Curie heard about the case and was shocked by the American working conditions. She confirmed that once radiation was in the system, it could never be removed. Her words, quoted in the court case, sounded a death knell to the women who had hoped for a treatment and maybe even a cure. There was screaming and fainting in the courtroom. The details of the trial are long and horrible, and I'll just say that US Radium did everything they could to prolong the case in hope that the women would just die before the second hearing. With her sister's permission, Molly's body was exhumed, and when the casket was opened, it was revealed that her well-preserved body was glowing with a soft light. The autopsy showed no signs of syphilis, surprise, but all of Molly's bones and her soft tissue was radioactive. They ended up settling out of court for $10,000 each and $600 annual payment. US Radium was still staunch in declaring that they'd done nothing wrong. All of the women died within 2 years of the case, and US Radium could still continue as normal. They may not have won the war, but they did win a couple of battles. Now, the death certificates of the victims would have radiation poisoning as cause of death, and the Food and Drug Administration was moved to ban radium-based products from being sold as health products. Now, this trial was in the national newspapers, and of course, the women who were doing the same job for Radium Dial in Ottawa, Illinois, read all about it. They ran to their manager's office in a state of panic. Did he know about the Radium Girls of New Jersey? Would the same thing happen to them? In fact, quite a few of them had been showing signs of ill health, and some had died mysteriously. In fact, Catherine Wolfe was even limping because one of her legs was becoming shorter than the other. They were told, "Settle down, ladies, we use different paint here in New Jersey." The firm did agree to give the dial painters regular medical tests, but they never gave them their test results. Radium Dial put out a huge one-page ad in the local newspaper saying they had no reason to believe they were endangering their workers, and if they had, they would have suspended operations, blah, 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 blah. Anyway, Catherine Wolfe, who had the shortened leg, was fired from Radium Dial, got married, became Catherine Donahue, and had 3 children. It wasn't until 1938 that she noticed a growth on her hip that soon became the size of a grapefruit. She knew what was coming next. Like Grace Fryer before her, she knew that she couldn't save herself, but she could save other people. people. Along with 7 former workmates, Catherine headed the charge in a lawsuit against Radium Dial. They were lucky enough to quickly find a lawyer willing to work pro bono, and against all hope, they won their case. But Radium Dial wasn't going to go down that easily, and appealed 8 times, hoping with each appeal to exhaust their accusers into an even earlier grave than the one that they'd made them. However, Catherine and her team won each appeal, testifying even when most of her lower jaw was gone and her body was able to sit upright without a metal corset. She died before the case was settled. The Supreme Court ordered Radium Dial to cease their appeals and ordered them to pay the remaining women. Radium Dial, though, ever slimy and disgusting, disappeared before settlement and reopened in New York. The Illinois Industrial Commission wouldn't cross state boundaries to get the money, and the company's $10,000 bond was all the remaining women could access and share amongst themselves. So no, these women did not get what they deserved, not even close, which is both infuriating and heartbreaking. What they did get, however, was for their actions to trigger major changes in the way employees in the radium industry were treated. The changes in workplace policies, because of these landmark court cases, saved numerous lives, and they set the precedent in the US for individual workers to be able to sue their employers for occupational injury. The remaining Radium girls formed the Society of the Living Dead, which shows that they still had a sense of humour, and they volunteered to take part in research studies that contributed greatly to the knowledge we have today of radium and the human body. Their courage, their tenacity, and their strength did make a difference. So I will finish this picture and I will put it up at the end of the video, so make sure you stay and see it. And although this was a really hard story to listen to, let's take some inspiration from their strength and let's try to be on the right side of history. Thank you so much for watching. Please like, subscribe to the channel, leave a comment. Please stay safe, stay magical, and I'll see you soon.